Okay, so picture this. 1857, a single event sets off a political earthquake that ends the rule of a corporation more powerful than most countries, the East India Company, and leads directly to the creation of the British Raj. This was the Indian Revolt, one of the most violent and transformative moments in the history of the British Empire.
So, how on earth did this happen? How could one single piece of military gear, a simple rifle cartridge, bring down a corporate giant and build a whole new empire in its place? Let's dive in.
To really get a grip on just how intense this revolt was, we've got to start with the flashpoint. Things had been simmering for decades, but it needed that one dramatic trigger. And that trigger, it was the brand new Enfield rifle. This is where things get really personal. To load this new rifle, the Indian soldiers, the sepoys, had to literally bite off the end of a paper cartridge. And the rumor that spread like wildfire was that the grease on these cartridges was made from cow and pig fat. Now, for Hindu soldiers, the cow is sacred. For Muslim soldiers, the pig is totally forbidden. So you can see this wasn't just a minor issue. It was a direct, deeply personal violation of their faith. So all that tension just explodes. On May 10th, 1857, in the city of Meerut, what starts as a military protest almost instantly spirals into this huge civil insurrection that just swallows up northern India. But, and this is key, the cartridge was only the spark.
To really get why it exploded, we need to look at the powder keg itself, all the political, economic, and social grievances that the East India Company had just let pile up for decades.
Politically, the company was making a ton of enemies with its aggressive expansion, and its most infamous tool, the doctrine of lapse. The rule was simple, and honestly pretty brutal. If an Indian ruler died without a male heir that the British considered legitimate, poof, their kingdom was just absorbed. And the fallout from this was just devastating. You had these established kingdoms like Satara, Nagpur, and Jhansi just wiped off the map by a legal trick. And hey, if the doctrine didn't quite fit, the British just found another excuse. Take Awadh, for example. It was annexed in 1856 based on this really controversial claim of misgovernance. You can imagine the sense of betrayal that created. It was just fuel for the fire. So you've got this political damage, and then you pile on these devastating financial policies. If the politics were about losing your kingdom, the economics were about losing everything else. It was, as the sources put it, a crushing financial strain. Let's break down how this worked, because it's pretty clever in a terrible way. The company demanded super high taxes, and, this is the kicker, they had to be paid in cash. The amount was fixed, so it didn't matter if you had a drought, a famine, a bad harvest, you still owed the exact same amount of money. What does that do? It forces countless farmers to borrow from moneylenders, trapping them in this cycle of debt until they lose their land. Suddenly, joining a rebellion doesn't seem like such a bad idea. And on top of all of that, there was this feeling of social and religious interference. The 1850 Religious Disabilities Act is a perfect example. See, under traditional Hindu law, if you converted to another religion, you couldn't inherit family property. Well, the British Act of 1850 changed that, allowing someone who converted, say, to Christianity, to still inherit. To many people, this looked like the British were literally changing the law to bribe people into leaving their faith. But this revolt wasn't just some faceless mob. No way. It was led by some truly extraordinary people, whose courage and defiance really gave the resistance a face. Let's meet some of them. First up, in Lucknow, the capital of that newly annexed state of Awadh, you have Begum Hazrat Mahal. She just took command. In a massive challenge to the British, she declared her young son the new ruler, basically taking back the authority they'd stolen. And when Lucknow eventually fell, did she surrender? Nope. She kept the resistance going from exile in Nepal. Her legacy is so huge that India later honored her with a commemorative stamp. Then you have Maulvi Ahmadullah Shah, known as the Lighthouse of Rebellion. This guy was a scholar, a writer, and a seriously fierce warrior. The British saw him as so dangerous that they offered a reward of 50,000 rupees for his arrest. That was a massive fortune back then, which just goes to show you how effective he really was. And his reputation was undeniable, even to his enemies. After he died, a British officer, Sir Thomas Seton, called him a man of undaunted courage and, get this, by far the best soldier among the rebels. I mean, that's some serious praise coming from the other side. And finally, we have one of the most incredible stories of the entire revolt, Kunwar Singh. This guy, at 80 years old, 80,
transformed from a local landlord into a brilliant guerrilla leader. He probably saw the company's policies threatening his own people, so he spent months preparing, gathering a force of 10,000 soldiers, and using these hit-and-run tactics that drove the British crazy.
And his commitment, it was just legendary. In April 1858, his hand gets shattered by a British bullet. So what does he do? Instead of letting it slow him down, he takes out his sword, cuts off his own hand at the elbow, and offers it to the Ganges River. Just an unbelievable act of will.
So, with these amazing leaders, how did it all end? Well, despite all this sacrifice, the revolt ultimately failed. But its failure, ironically, led directly to the end of the East India Company and the very controversial birth of a whole new empire, the British Raj.
So, what did it all mean? Well, right away, history splits into two camps. The British establishment tried to downplay it, calling it a simple sepoy mutiny, just a military thing, no popular support. But Indian nationalists, looking back, framed it as the First War of Independence, a planned multi-faith struggle against foreign rulers.
The reality is probably somewhere in the middle, and that's where we see why it failed. The biggest problem? A lack of a unified vision. The revolt was mostly just in northern India. Some really important groups, like many Sikh soldiers, actually sided with the British, and a lot of the local leaders were fighting to get their own personal kingdoms back, not for some big unified idea of India.
And the direct result of that failure was the Government of India Act of 1858. This act was basically the company's death sentence. It completely abolished its rule, transferred power directly to the British Crown, and officially created the British Raj. It also officially ended the 300-year-old Mughal dynasty and completely reorganized the army, splitting it up along what they called martial races to make sure another uprising like this could never happen again. But don't think this was some simple, clean transfer of power. Oh no, it was super controversial back in the UK. In England, the press was totally split. In Ireland, liberal papers called the whole thing a masterpiece of human stupidity. Scotland was pretty much the only place that was supportive across the board. This just shows there was this huge debate happening back home about what the empire should even be. So, here's the bottom line. The British Raj wasn't inevitable. It wasn't some smooth, planned transition. It was a messy, deeply contested political choice that was born out of crisis and forged in the fire of this rebellion. And that leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If the very foundation of the Raj was so shaky and so fiercely debated back in 1858, how do you think those initial disagreements might have echoed through the next 100 years of British-Indian relations?